what should the opening image of this video be? A cat, of course. Gotta keep things on brand. Hi. Today, I want to talk about opening images because they're one of my favorite things to brainstorm. Often, I find that I can't finish a novel successfully if I feel like the opening image is wrong. But before I get into what makes a right opening image, let's back up. What is an opening image? Those of you who have read Save the Cat are familiar with the phrase. Other readers might call it a hook, or maybe you have another name for it, but basically it's the first scene in your book. It does a lot of important stuff. It hooks the reader, it establishes things like voice and tone, and most of the time it works as an establishing shot for your main character too. Now this isn't always true. Sometimes people will include a prologue from a different point of view, but a lot of the time it is. So because your opening image has to do all of this, it's pretty easy to get wrong. But I have 3 tips to make nailing your opening image a little easier. So tip 1 is to don't stress too much about your opening line. I'm telling you this as someone who has wasted what could have been very productive writing sessions just brainstorming first lines. You see, when you're drafting a scene, and this applies to any scene, you shouldn't get too bogged down in fixing things on a sentence-to-sentence level. I think this advice is especially true of an opening image because by the end of your first draft, you're probably going to have a better idea of the novel's voice anyway. So when it comes to drafting your opening scene, don't worry too much about having an ultra-hooky first sentence. Instead, make sure that your opening image is really strong on a content level, and then you can go back and fix the sentences later. So tip 2 is figure out what's most important about your character and then tell it to us. I know it sounds like this tip is assuming you're starting with your main character, but just stick with me. A lot of beginning novelists make the mistake of starting their story with a physical description. I'm sure we can all think of a few stories or fanfics that do this, but be honest with yourself. Is what your character looks like really the most important thing about them? Because I hope not. Instead of just giving a random detail, I want you to really think and ask yourself, what is the thing that you want people to know about your main character right off the bat? That is what you should be focusing on in your opening image. And even if you aren't writing your opening image from your main character's point of view, you can still look at it through this lens. What is this other scene telling us about your main character? Why is it important that we know it right away? This is how you should be approaching your opening scene. And finally, tip 3 is consider how you want to hook your reader. I think this is the point where a lot of writers will say something like, start with an exciting action sequence, or never start with dialogue. But honestly, I think all of this advice is sort of subjective. There are a million ways to start a story and a billion ways to construct an opening image, and none of them are exactly wrong. Some of them just might be wrong for your story or wrong for what you're trying to do. So I want you to ask yourself, how do I want to hook my reader? How do I want to make them keep reading? You could do an intense action scene that makes them wonder what's gonna happen next. Or you could give them a relatable protagonist that they feel attached to. Or you could give them an image that's so strange and nonsensical that they keep reading to figure out what's going on. And those are just 3 things you can do. I'm sure you could think of a bunch of other ways to hook a reader. Just make sure you keep asking yourself, what is my reader's incentive to keep reading? If you can answer that question in a way that satisfies you, you've probably got a solid opening to work with. But it's easy to sit here and list off tips, right? I want to give you a concrete example of how I applied these tips to my debut novel, The Songbird's Refrain. So I'm just going to read you the first page and a half, and I'm going to tell you how I applied these tips in my own writing. Okay. You Aren't Important would probably never win the Most Optimistic Mantra award, but I found it comforting. It worked like this. During 4th period, my teacher called me by the wrong name. After class, my academic advisor forgot about our appointment to go over college applications, so we had to reschedule. Then, on my way out the door, my phone buzzed. I checked it, hoping for news about the school's musical callbacks, but instead I got a spam email from a dating site that I was absolutely too young to be using. After all that, a little teen angst seemed justified, or at least a bit of bemoaning this grand conspiracy against me. Instead, I told myself, you aren't important. None of this is a personal attack. Your teacher, advisor, and director aren't plotting Operation Ruin Elizabeth's Day. They're just busy people with busy lives, and who are you? A high school senior with a decent GPA and a hand that pretty much never goes up in class. You aren't important. Don't take it personally. I rubbed at my shoulder, the fabric of my shirt gliding along the faded scar there. I glanced at the spam email again. At least there are hot singles in my area who are dying to meet me. I laughed, then looked around. The hallway was empty, and since my appointment got canceled, I had no reason to stick around. I hiked my backpack up higher on my shoulders and stepped outside. The early October air nipped at my cheeks and nose. Shivering, I shoved my hands into my hoodie pocket. It was probably time to start riding the bus again, but I liked walking. Home wasn't far, and chilly air beat the clogged smell of hormones and gym socks any day. I started walking, mentally listing the homework I had to do and the shows I wanted to watch after. It wasn't the best distraction from the missing callback, but I knew better than to dwell. You aren't important, I reminded myself, my hand snaking beneath my backpack's strap to rub at the faded scar on my shoulder again. I continued along the familiar route home on autopilot, until I saw the flyer. And that's it. From there on out, Elizabeth sees the flyer that advertises the mysterious show, talks with one of its members, and decides to go. But I wanted to focus on this first bit in particular because I think that it really illustrates what I'm trying to tell you. So as far as the first tip goes, yeah, the first line was not perfect when I drafted this at first. Instead, I focused on the content of the scene and went from there. As far as choosing what I wanted to introduce about the character, I wanted you to know from the beginning that Elizabeth was a little socially isolated, she didn't think very highly of herself, and she has a habit of using humor to deflect her insecurities. The mantra of "you aren't important" is both a running motif in the book and a look at how she operates and looks at the world. And sprinkled in all that, I put in some concrete information about her, like her name, her age, her hobbies. And while I do tell you about the scar on her shoulder, which is another thing that returns throughout the novel, I saved most of the physical description for later in the first chapter because I didn't think that that was the most important thing about her. And hopefully what I do focus on makes you relate to her, or at least care about her. That was my aim with the first chapter, is making a relatable protagonist that people wanted to follow. I did this so that by the time she does go to the show and is kidnapped by the antagonist, you're invested in her and want to see if she makes it out okay. So if you want to see how the rest of this chapter goes, I actually have the first 3 chapters available on my website, which I will link to down below. And while you won't be able to read the rest of the novel until September 3rd, you can pre-order it now. I'm also offering advanced reader copies to book reviewers, so feel free to get in touch if that's something you'd be interested in. And beyond Songbird stuff, I'd also love to hear how you tackle opening images. Or maybe some of your favorite opening images in fiction. Feel free to leave me a comment or hit me up on social media. And if you like what I'm doing here, subscribe. Okay, bye. It is. I said in the middle of that sentence like a doofus. Okay. I thought that was a bug, but it was just a piece of fuzz. Okay. Oh, my water bottle has been in shot this whole time. I don't know if that phrase makes sense. I applied this. Where's my book? Shit. Right, okay.